So for the first question is just letting us know that we're going to be working with multiple Kubernetes clusters where we'll be able to practice backing up and restoring etcd databases. And so here is just letting us know that we're currently logged into the student node instead of the control plane for one of the clusters. And the student node has a kubectl client already installed so that it can access the Kubernetes clusters in the environment. So just go ahead and poke around and take a look. So if I just do a kubectl get node, we can see that we do in fact have kubectl configured. And if I do a kubectl config view, this is going to show us all of the clusters that are configured. Next question is asking us how many clusters are defined in the kubeconfig on the student node. So we just ran a kubectl config view, and if we go under the cluster section, we can see that there's two clusters, cluster 1 and cluster 2. The next question is asking us how many nodes are part of cluster 1. And make sure to switch to the context of cluster 1 before you actually run your commands. So let's make sure we do that. I'm going to do a kubectl config use-context and then cluster 1. And then I'm going to do a kubectl get nodes so that we can verify the total number of nodes. And we can see here that there's two total nodes, the control plane and then node 1. So I'll select 2. Next question is asking us what is the name of the control plane node in cluster 2. So let's switch to cluster 2. And I'm going to do a kubectl get nodes. And we can see that the name of the control plane node is cluster2-control plane. So this question is just letting us know that we can SSH to all of the nodes in either of the clusters by just doing SSH and the name of the node. So in this case, if I wanted to get to the control plane node of cluster 2, I would just do SSH and then the name of the node I want to go to. I'll paste that in, and that'll take us to the control plane node. And if you want to exit out and go back to the student node, you just type in exit. So the next question is asking us how is etcd configured for cluster 1? Is it using stacked etcd or is it using an external etcd server? So to do that, first of all, we're going to change to cluster 1. And the easiest way to verify this is if we do a kubectl get pods and I do a -n kube-system. If we see a pod here for etcd, that means we're using stacked etcd, which means the etcd server is running on the control plane node itself. And another way to actually check this is if I do a kubectl get, actually we do a describe pod, and we're going to describe the API server. This will have the URL that the API server will need to use to actually communicate with the etcd server. And so if that points to localhost or the IP address of the control plane node, then we know that it's using stacked etcd. And so if we take a look at the commands here, and there should be one for etcd server, and we can see that the etcd server is in fact using the localhost IP. So it's using stacked etcd because it's running on the control plane node itself. The next question is asking us how is etcd configured on cluster 2. So we're going to run the same steps, but I'm first going to change to cluster 2. And I'm going to do a kubectl get pods -n kube-system. And if we take a look at all of the pods here, we do not see a etcd pod, but this could be maybe because there's some sort of issue with the server. Let's actually SSH to the control plane node. So I'll do a kubectl get nodes. And I'm going to SSH to the control plane node. And we could take a look at all of the static pod configurations by moving into /etc Kubernetes manifests. I'm going to do an ls, and we can see here there's only 3 manifests here. So there's nothing for the etcd server. So that looks like this is most likely not stacked etcd, but we can verify that by doing a kubectl get pods -n cube-system. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at the config on the API server like we did before. So I'll do kubectl describe pod and then -n cube-system. And if we take a look at the configs, there's going to be a etcd server config. We can see that that is pointing to a separate IP address. So that means that we are using a external etcd server. And the next question is asking us, what is the IP address of the external etcd server used by cluster 2? Well, that's going to be the 192.33.162.21. So the next question is asking us, what is the default data directory used by the etcd data store used in cluster 1? And so we're going to go back to cluster 1. I'm going to change this to cluster 1. And I'm going to do kubectl get pod. And I actually want the namespace of kube system. So we're going to just do a describe on the etcd pod. And this is going to show us the configuration for etcd. And so if I go up here and we want to take a look at the --data--dir flag, this is going to tell us the default data directory. So it's going to be var lib etcd. This next question is just letting us know that we're going to need to SSH to the etcd server for future questions. And so to do that, we're just going to open up a new tab. And we're going to do SSH etcd-server. And so now we'll have a connection to the etcd server. So the next question is asking us, what is the default data directory used by the etcd data store in cluster 2? So that means we're going to have to connect to the etcd server, the external etcd server. And I'm going to do a ps-ef pipe grep -i etcd. So this is going to show us all of the configs for the etcd server. And we want to look for that same flag, the --data-dir. So this is going to be /var/lib/etcd-data. So /var/lib/etcd-data. So how many nodes are part of the etcd cluster that the etcd server is a part of? And so to do this, we want to run the command etcd-ctl member list. But if I just run this, it's not going to work. We're going to have to pass in a few connection details. And the first thing that we actually have to do is set the version. We're going to use etcd-ctl API version 3. So we'll set that environment variable. So I'll do etcd-ctl_API equals 3. It's going to set it to version 3. Then we'll run the etcd-ctl command, but we're going to have to pass in a couple things. First of all, what is the endpoint? So I'll do --endpoints equals. And you could just take a look at what that is by going to the listen client URLs. And so you can just grab this URL right here because it's listening on localhost because we're connected to it. And then we're going to have to pass in the CA cert. And that can be found right here. So if we look for trusted CA file, copy this. Then we need the cert. And the cert is going to come from here, cert file. And then lastly, we need the key. And that's going to come from this flag key file. And now we can run the member list command. And so all of these details like the endpoint, the cert, this is all going to come from just grepping the etcd process. And so when we run this, we can see that there's one entry. So there's one member in this cluster. So the next question, we have to take a backup of etcd on cluster 1 and save it onto the student node at the path /opt/cluster1.db. So let's go back to terminal 1, which is going to be our student node. And I'm going to do a kubectl config use context cluster 1. And So to do this, first of all, we have to get information about the etcd server. So I'm going to run a kubectl get pod -n cube-system, because remember, this is using etcd in stacked mode, so it's going to be running as a pod. And I'm going to do a kubectl describe pod, and then we're going to grab the etcd pod. And there's a couple of pieces of information that we're going to need. So since we're going to be using the etcd-ctl utility, CLI utility, we're going to need the advertise client URL. So this is the URL that we can reach the etcd server. We're going to have access to the cert file, and we're going to need to have access to the key file, as well as the CA cert, which should be cert file, client cert, and trusted CA file. So those are going to be the four things that we need. And so I'm actually going to SSH to that node. So I'll do kubectl get nodes, and we're going to SSH to the control plane node. And here I'm going to first set the API version to be, actually, before we did, let me just run that same command. Okay, so this is, I'm just going to keep all this for reference so that I don't clear it out again. So now I can do, first I'm going to set it to version 3. And then we're going to run etcd-ctl. And the command that we want to run is snapshot save /opt/ and then we're going to save it to cluster1.db. So this is going to take a snapshot, but we have to provide all the connection details. So here I'm going to pass in the -- endpoints flag, and this is going to be the advertise URL. And then we'll do the -- CA cert. Then we want to do the -- cert flag. And then we'll do the -- key. All right, and so that should take a snapshot, and if I go to /opt, we should see it in there. And we can see cluster1.db. But the instructions say that we want to save this onto the student node, so I'm going to exit out of here. So I'm back on the student node. And I'm going to just copy that file onto the student node. So I'll do cluster1 - control plane. And that file is stored in /opt/ cluster1.db. And I'm going to save this in /opt as well. So that copied over. If I do a ls/opt, the file should be on the student node, and we can go ahead and run verification. And that was successful. So for the last question, it's saying that a etcd backup for cluster2 is stored at /opt/ cluster2.db. Use this snapshot file to carry out a restore on cluster2 to a new path of /var /lib /etcd-data -new. And once the restore is complete, ensure that the control plane components on cluster2 are running. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to go to my etcd server. Actually, first of all, let's go back to our student node, and let's just verify that we have the cluster2.db file. So I'll do ls/opt. So we have cluster2.db. So we're going to SCP this to the etcd server machine. So we'll do scp/opt cluster2.db, and this should go to etcd-server. And I'll send that to the root folder. So now if I go back to my etcd server, if I do ls, that file should be there. So now we're going to do a snapshot restore on the etcd server. So I'm going to first set the version to 3. And then we just run etcdctl snapshot restore. And the location of the backup, so it's going to be cluster2.db. And then where do we want to restore this to? I'll just say --data-dir. They want it in /var/lib etcd-data-new. And we don't need to pass in any of the certificate or the key files into this command because we're just doing a restore. So we don't actually even need to connect to the etcd server. And so this is going to run that restore. And so after that's done, if we go to that folder of var lib, and we see that file, we have to make sure that the permissions are all set. So right now etcd-data-new is set to be the root user as the ownership. So we want to change that to be the etcd user. So I'm going to do chown, and then I'll do etcd, and then we want to change that to be the etcd-data-new. So now if I do an ls-la, we should see that it's now owned by etcd. So after we make that change, let's go ahead and change the configuration on the etcd process. So I'm going to go to /etc/systemd system etcd.service. And the only thing we got to change is the --data-dir flag to point to the new folder. So I'll save that. After we make those changes, we're going to have to do a systemctl daemon-reload. And then we'll have to do a systemctl restart etcd. And let's just do a quick status. Okay, so it's up and running. And so now the last step that we have to do is we have to restart all the control plane components so that they're not using any kind of stale data. So I'm going to go back to terminal 1. And let me just make sure I'm connected to... Okay, so I'm still on cluster 1. Let me change this to be cluster 2. Okay, and so now if I do a kubectl get pods, I'm going to go ahead and restart the control plane components. So I'm going to restart the control manager and the scheduler, and we're also going to restart the kubelet process on the control plane node. So I'm going to do kubectl delete pods, so controller manager, as well as the scheduler. So now if I do kube system, let's just make sure that they come back up. All right, so now both are running, and you can see they've been restarted. We're then going to SSH to the control plane node. And we're going to do a kubectl, sorry, not kubectl, we're going to do a systemctl restart kubelet. Okay, and so that's back up and running. So that should complete the whole backup process or the restore process, and we can go ahead and run the verification. And we can see that's complete. And so that's going to wrap up this this practice test.